Death Stranding 2 released in June of 2025 exclusively for the PlayStation 5 for $70 US. It's a direct sequel to the original Death Stranding, and this game takes place about a year later and involves Sam traveling across Mexico and Australia to bring them into the chiral network. With a few new gadgets, locations, and enemies, is Death Stranding 2 worth playing? This review is going to answer that question.
Raindrops are falling on my head, and just like the guy's feet are too big for his head, nothing seems to fit. Those raindrops are falling on my head.
Hey, not bad, little porter. Not bad at all.
Alright, let's begin the review, as we always do, by discussing the graphics and technical performance of Death Stranding 2. The game looks incredible. There's no doubt in my mind that anyone who plays Death Stranding 2 on PlayStation 5 is going to be impressed. Whether you end up playing it in quality or performance mode, the landscapes, the character models, the cutscenes are all an improvement on Death Stranding's already impressive visuals. The game runs really well on PS5, especially on performance mode. You'll get 60 FPS and no frame rate drops. But if you want better graphics, you can reduce the FPS to 30 for a visual increase. The game does default to this quality mode, so I think that's what the developers would prefer you to play on, but I stuck with performance mode for that buttery smooth camera rotation. Either way, the game looks good, and the new landscapes really brighten the mood of the game. Death Stranding 1 was a lot of dark areas, a lot of blacks and blues and grays. Death Stranding 2 has deserts and forested areas, brightening everything up and breaking up the landscape. For the technical performance, apart from the rock-solid FPS, it's an improvement over the original as well. It's less janky overall, especially the vehicles, which seem to stick to the ground better. Still not perfect, but there's still a fair amount of jank in the game, and copy and pasted locations from the original, but it is a lot better. But speaking of copy and pasting, there's a lot of reused assets from the original, which is to be expected. I didn't think anyone was expecting the developers to just toss everything out and start fresh, but nearly all the equipment and structures are the same as Death Stranding 1, and the delivery shelters are exactly the same. Something that's odd considering that Death Stranding 1 was set in America, Death Stranding 2 is in Australia, it's a completely different continent that's cut off from the rest of the world decades ago. But somehow their shelters and uniforms are exactly the same. Strange how that kind of works. Overall, game looks and runs great.
Who are you? Fragile?
Were you cooking?
What are you doing here?
Because I'm free.
I've been looking for you.
Nothing's worried.
Alright, for this review, I'm going to assume that you've played the first Death Stranding. You might be able to get away with playing this one without going through the original, but you're probably going to be pretty lost even with the recap. I'm going to avoid most spoilers, so I'm just going to briefly touch on the story of Death Stranding 2. It takes place a year later. Sam's raising Lou, his former bridge baby. Fragile comes along and asks him to reconnect Mexico, so Sam does it. Some stuff happens along the way. Then he goes to Australia to connect them to the chiral network as well. That's pretty much it, how deep I'm going to go with the story. But for this review, still without spoilers, I am going to critique the narrative structure a bit. Death Stranding 2 didn't have the best story pacing. Hideo Kojima seems to have a talent for building a world and lore around it with incredible and strange concepts, but his characters and storytelling do need a lot of work. Death Stranding had incredibly long cutscenes, repeating story sections, and a tendency to either over-explain simple concepts or choose to not tell you anything about the interesting stuff that I wanted to know more about. Death Stranding 2's story is told better, but also worse than the original. It's better in that the pacing seems to have been worked on. Hideo Kojima obviously took the criticism about the original to heart and worked on his pacing a bit, slimmed down cutscenes and interspersed them with more gameplay moments. But Death Stranding 2's story is worse in that it doesn't really go further into the strange world the game's set in. It does explore some of the characters more, introduces new ones, but it doesn't really give you more lore about the world and this game's universe. It's like whatever information you had from the first game, that's pretty much what you're going to get in the second. It doesn't really introduce any new questions, nor does it answer any of the lingering questions I had from the first game. It's impressive in a way to have an entire sequel set in a new continent and not manage to inform you about the most important concepts of the game. There's no new revelations, apart from some regarding the characters themselves. Another part of Death Stranding 2 that may not satisfy people is that Hideo Kojima, for all the effort he seems to have made in improving this game on the first, he still didn't hand the story writing over to a team of writers. I think he's best when he gives like broad concepts and ideas, but he isn't good for characters, dialogue, or giving people names. Tarman, Dead Man, Heart Man, Doll Man, everything is something man in this game. He has this tendency to introduce wild, world-changing concepts and story beats, then solve them right away. Rather than let it build throughout the game, he's like, oh, this was the real enemy all along. You're all screwed now. Then someone will appear and be like, nope, you're wrong. I anticipated you all along. It's a really strange way of storytelling, and I think if Hideo Kojima had just said to a writing team, hey, this is my idea, go run with it, bring it back, let's talk about it, they probably could have implemented the story better. It's obvious he really likes these big, grand reveals, but he also likes to counter them right away. But it all feels rushed at times, and it can give you whiplash. But overall, the story of Death Stranding 2 is still really good, with some very emotional moments that feel really well earned and stayed with you. Death Stranding had a perfect ending, and it didn't really need a sequel, but I'm glad they did. While it doesn't have its uniqueness that made that first game so incredible, Death Stranding 2's story is still very memorable. Alright, now for the main section of the review, where I discuss the gameplay of Death Stranding 2. Again, I'm going to assume you played and beat the first game, as that experience will shape a lot of what I'm going to talk about in Death Stranding 2. Hideo Kojima, when discussing the first game, basically said that he was disappointed that a lot of players didn't beat it. Something like half of all players stopped playing before or after the third chapter, which is like a huge drop-off. So when he made the sequel, he wanted to make it more accessible to players. And boy, did he do that. Death Stranding 2 plays very similar to the first game, where you're trekking across the land to bring packages to shelters and linking them all to the chiral network, all while facing harsh terrain, BTs, and human enemies. And to do that, the game gives you a ton of tools. Basically, all the equipment and options from the first game combined with some new stuff to help you out. This all allows the player a wide variety of choice on how you want to approach the game, and, in my opinion, does make it a lot easier. Death Stranding 2, in my opinion, is easier than the first game. The reason comes from the fact that, as a player, you've basically played this game before in Death Stranding 1. You have 40 or more hours of experience taking packages across harsh terrains, killing BTs or sneaking past them, and Death Stranding 2 just basically picks up where the game left off. Death Stranding introduced you to a lot of this stuff, and the way I played the game at the beginning of Death Stranding 1 was totally different than how I played it at the end, or when I replayed it a few years later. At the very start of the first Death Stranding, I stocked up on ladders and ropes, I brought a ton of stuff to make my way across the land. At the end, and during most of my replay, I didn't use any ladders or ropes at all. Instead, I just stocked up a vehicle, drove it until I got stuck on a rock or ran out of battery, then I just ran, picking my way wherever was easiest, avoiding BTs and humans where I could. When I did run into trouble, a quick blood grenade or another player's ladder would help me out. This all meant that by the time I got to Death Stranding 2, I was used to packing light and making use of other people's gear and a vehicle. Death Stranding 2 feels easier because I knew at the start how to navigate this world, and sure, there are some new challenges, but you can meet them in nearly the same way as the first game. The second reason the sequel is easier comes in two forms: terrain improvements and vehicle jank. The terrain in the original had large sections where vehicles just weren't the most efficient way of getting across them. Sure, you could use them, but I usually just drove until I got stuck on a rock, then I just walked because it was quicker than trying to get my bike or truck unstuck. Death Stranding 2's terrain can be driven across from start to finish. Even the mountains in the middle of the map can be driven on with all the standard vehicles with no upgrades. And the batteries last a lot longer in Death Stranding 2, meaning I drove the entire Australian continent the entire game and I only ran out of battery power twice. As for vehicle jankiness, the first game made vehicles viable but difficult at times because they got stuck on every rock and weird terrain dip like glue. They were slow at times, they ran out of batteries too quickly, and they drove like absolute garbage. Death Stranding 2 improves upon that jank, making vehicles the best option to deliver goods no matter where and when. You also get them nearly at the start of the game, so there's no reason to not drive everywhere all the time. Sure, you get other tools, but they're all like less efficient and risky than just packing everything in a truck. Need to climb a mountain? You can get ropes and ladders and good boots and climb it. Or you can just get in the truck, take nothing but a single gun in your package, and drive there in a fraction of the time. Honestly, there was never a reason to not take a vehicle, and that takes something away from the game's traversal. It no longer felt like Sam against the wilderness. It felt like cruising around like an Amazon delivery person, barely slowing down for anything. And that's before the Cairo network makes roads and bridges that makes it even easier. Death Stranding 2 has an increased focus on combat. Sure, you're delivering a lot of packages, but this is a shooting game primarily now rather than a walking game. And Death Stranding is just not a good shooter. There are improvements to the combat with more guns, better ammo management upgrades, new stealth options, and hand-to-hand upgrades, but you do need to shoot or fight a lot, and the combat system still isn't refined enough for what I would want a combat-focused game to be. You still need to switch weapons very slowly. Sam's still slow and clumsy. He falls down easily when he's hit by any enemy. He puts away his gun sometimes in the middle of the fight because I accidentally had him grip for balance instead of aiming and firing. When you run out of ammo, you still need to manually offload an empty gun rather than just tossing it away automatically and switching to the next one. But conversely, the combat's also a lot easier. Your guns work against humans and BTs, nearly every single one of them. Rather than having like a BT gun and a BT grenade and a human stun gun and a human grenade, so you used to have to combine a bunch of different options, you can just have a single gun in Death Stranding 2 and shoot everyone because bullets just don't kill humans, they just knock them out, and they also kill BTs. So if you just take a single gun that you like, load it up with ammo upgrades, and shoot everything, then you're set. When you run out, the game is littered with spare guns to pick up. Combat works, and it's functional, but it's just not, like, fantastic. Combat in Death Stranding 1 felt like your last option at times, something you did when the BTs forced you to, or you got caught sneaking past enemies. Combat in Death Stranding 2 is often the first and only option. You just need to pick your favorite gun and just go wild. Finally, most enemies in this game are humans or mechs rather than BTs. There are only a few times that you actually need to fight BTs, and they die pretty easily. The sequel even introduces new BTs like Watchers who can actually see you, but there were only 2 instances where they were scripted that I had to fight them, both towards the beginning of the game. BTs are almost a nuisance in Death Stranding 2, something to go around because they're time-consuming rather than a real threat. All this means is that the tension that was present in the original is largely gone in the sequel. Alright, let's go into the pros and cons of Death Stranding 2. For the pros, the game is stunningly gorgeous. The landscape is incredible and detailed, and sometimes it's so realistic that I'm surprised that PlayStation 5 could run it. I can't wait to see it on PC. The story has some emotional highs and lows, and will stick with you a long time after the credits roll. Death Stranding 2 is much more accessible to players who may have found the start of the original off-putting. Sam is much better prepared for the challenges in this game. For the cons, experienced players are going to find deliveries and combat to be easier. There's little point in planning when you can just hop in your truck, take a machine gun, and beat the game. Combat is a much bigger focus in the sequel, and it's not the best part of the game. There are a lot of new combat options, but if you don't like combat at the start of the game, it doesn't really change or get better. While the story has a good arc and some good moments, it doesn't really introduce anything more about the world and the universe itself. This is a story about Sam, set in the Death Stranding world, rather than a story about the Death Stranding with Sam in it. Take out the Death Stranding and replace it with like weird, strange technology, and it would probably be close to the same story. And that's it for another review. So, is Death Stranding 2 worth playing? Of course it is. If you loved the first one like I did, you'll like this one as well, although you might not love it in the same way. It takes Death Stranding, sands off those rough edges and things that turned a lot of players off, and then streamlined it to make it more appealing. But unfortunately, that means that it is less weird and unique than the first game. Don't get me wrong, it's still a weird game, and it's almost like something was lost along the way. It doesn't quite do anything that will match that feeling I had when I played the first Death Stranding game and witnessed a void out or snuck through a horde of BTs at the beginning of the game. I'm the Casual Console Gamer on YouTube, and I'll see you all in the next review.